What is leaky gut? Today we're going to cover something that is relatively new in the health and wellness world. It's definitely been mentioned in the past, say 10, 20 years, it's kind of come up, but now we have a lot more data on it, a lot more concrete evidence as to its existence and kind of how it happens. What we're talking about is leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So today we're going to cover, what is leaky gut, how does it happen, the various types, which we have mentioned before. We're also going to delve into the layers of protection we have in the gut and how it's kind of leaky gut isn't simply just, hey, a lot of people are aware of something called tight junctions that hold cells together. But before that becomes a problem, other things become a problem as well. So you have multiple layers of protection in the gut. The gut, specifically within the intestines, the small and large, is a single layer thick. These cells have to replenish themselves, they have to die, and then we have to make new cells. So this barrier, at the cellular level, isn't always super tight, and so we have other layers of protection that can prevent things from going from the intestinal lumen into the bloodstream. And so, as long as we have multiple layers of protection, we should be protected. But sometimes this fails. We're going to discuss what that is and how that happens. We're also going to talk about areas that can become leaky. Many people just think of kind of the intestines when they're talking about leaky gut. Oftentimes they're referring specifically to the small intestine or large intestine, but the oral cavity as well as the esophagus and the stomach can also become leaky. And it's important to know where your problems are occurring so you can know how to address them. Then we'll move on to testing for leaky gut. This is a problem, this being a new kind of field of research. We don't have a lot of great testing options for leaky gut. Some of the initial ones, such as zonulin, have turned out to be not as good as we once thought. And since it's really hard to validate these things, since they haven't really been tested well in humans, it's hard to get a validated test for leaky gut. We'll discuss one such test, which does have some pretty good promise, but overall testing for leaky gut isn't really useful unless you're using it in the appropriate manner. And then finally, we'll talk about addressing leaky gut, the basics, things you need to be doing on a day-to-day basis. The first thing people think of when they have leaky gut, and I can tell you this is about 99.9999% of the questions, is, what supplement can I take to fix leaky gut? Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Supplements, while potentially useful, are really not going to do most of the legwork here. This is mostly going to be a lifestyle related, lifestyle related therapeutic approach with potential use for supplements once you get everything working in your favor. What is leaky gut? Leaky gut is the passage of materials through or between cells in the gastrointestinal tract. When this happens, bacterial components, bacteria themselves, and food enter our cardiovascular and lymphatic system and can cause problems within our body, ramping up inflammation, hyperactivating the immune system, etc., etc. So the first type is transcellular. The transcellular pathway simply means things get absorbed through the cell, so they're actually going into the cell that makes up the epithelial barrier, and then going through that cell into either the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. We know this is very common with something such as a high-fat diet. There's a molecule called lipopolysaccharide that's in the plasma membrane of gram-negative bacteria, and it's highly inflammatory. Since it's fat soluble, when we eat tons of fat, it can kind of come into our cells with the fat, get packaged into how we package our fat into something called a chylomicron, and then brought into the lymphatic system. That is transcellular permeability. The next one is paracellular permeability, where these same components, bacteria, food, go between our cells through faulty tight junctions. And we normally have paracellular permeability to things like sodium and water. We do not want to have paracellular permeability of food antigens, or what are known as MAMPs, which are microbial associated molecular patterns. When they get in, they can cause inflammation. Additionally, we can see the through the paracellular pathway. We have dendritic cells in our gut that kind of reach through the cells in between them and kind of samples what's in there, and bacteria can interact with that as well and cause an immune response, inflammation, and you can see a breakdown of the tight junction proteins. Finally, we have the unrestricted pathway. This is simply what happens when you have an erosion of the intestinal barrier or an ulcer. Typically we find these in the stomach and the duodenum, and then this is effectively just a hole where there's nothing preventing anything from coming in, so you get bacteria, microbial associated molecular patterns, and food antigens coming in straight through the barrier. Here we have the multiple layers of protection inside of the gut. This is important to understand because a lot of people just think, hey, my tight junctions broke down and things can't get through, but there's actually a lot more going on. Up here we have an outer mucus layer, and it is kind of more porous, it's looser. This is where you have all of your microbiome. So in this outer mucus layer, we have a physical barrier, which is the mucus. We have the microbes within it that are kind of crowding out the bad guys. We have an outer loose mucus layer effectively throughout the entire digestive tract. Inside of the stomach and the colon, we have a more dense inner mucus layer right here. This dense inner mucus layer is less penetrable. Bacteria don't get through there, and they so this is effectively just a thicker, more dense layer that prevents bacteria from encroaching on the intestinal barrier. It also provides, kind of a cushion between, food and things such as fiber or things that are a little more rough going through your digestive tract. Additionally, in the stomach, this inner mucus layer is what's protecting your stomach from hydrochloric acid, because hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen are, going to break down proteins, and if they come into contact with your intestinal barrier, they're going to cause those to break down. So we don't want that to happen. And then finally, we have the actual epithelial barrier. I'm kind of going through here. There are tight junctions in between these cells holding them together. This is where we're going to see if these other barriers fail. And then this barrier fails as well. You're going to get things coming across. As mentioned in the previous slide, there is also transcellular permeability, particularly in diets that contain a lot more fat. You're going to absorb more. Fortunately, these are going into the lymphatic system, so in an otherwise healthy individual, not kind of doing this too much, it shouldn't cause too many problems. And we should also mention that we have the immune system. This is going to differ between the different parts of the gastrointestinal tract, whether you're talking about the stomach, the small intestine, or large intestine. Here on the left-hand side, you'll see we have a lot more immune stuff going on here as opposed to here. That's because here we're dealing with this small intestine. The small intestine does not have a denser inner layer. It just has a loose layer, and in this loose layer you're going to have this immune system secreting antimicrobial peptides and things of that nature to also provide a chemical barrier. The reason we don't have an dense inner mucus layer here is because we need to absorb our nutrients, and if we have a dense impenetrable inner mucus layer, we will not absorb our nutrients very well. That is what we'll find more here in the large intestine. The immune system provides a much lower they kind of contribute much lower to the barrier protecting status in the colon, and the reasoning behind that is we have this dense inner mucus layer that can kind of function as a literal wall between our epithelial cells and our microbes. Before we dive into kind of the deeper gastrointestinal tract, we want to talk about the mouth a little bit. The mouth can become permeable. If any of you have gum disease, you floss and your teeth bleed, clearly you understand this. So your oral cavity can become permeable, and it is the second largest and most diverse microbiome, so it is really important for you to maintain good oral health. This will affect the distal segments. In other words, this microbiome in your mouth is going to get into your stomach, it's going to get in your small intestine, and it's going to even seed the colonic microbiome. So maintaining good oral health is absolutely critical. The mouth is literally the gateway that bacteria use to get into your body. So make sure that you maintain good oral health. We will provide a link to our most recent video on oral health in the description. You really should check that out. It's really important. There's a lot of evidence, the most recent of which saying that 90% of the microbes in your mouth will probably find their way into your small intestine, and 40% will find their way into your colon. So if you have poor oral health, you can expect to have poor gastrointestinal health throughout your entire GI tract, not simply just, cavities and gingivitis and things of that nature. We're going to move from the mouth past the esophagus into the stomach. The esophagus is really important, and it can become permeable. Generally, the problems that are going on in the esophagus, since the esophagus doesn't really do much, it's just a passageway from the mouth to the stomach. So if you do have esophageal permeability, if it's kind of up top, this may be due to poor oral health. If it's down towards the bottom, this is likely due to a problem within the stomach. So here we're looking at what goes on in the stomach. The stomach is highly acidic. Again, we have that dense mucus layer protecting your epithelial cells within your stomach from damage from the gastric acid. There's also a pH buffer. There is a mucus bicarbonate barrier. In this barrier, bicarbonate will help kind of bring down the pH. It'll neutralize the acid. So when we look at what's going on in the stomach, in the lumen, or the central part where the food's coming in, the pH is very, very low, very, very acidic at 1.5. This mucus bicarbonate barrier drops that pH down to a pH of 7, which is a neutral pH. If it got too low, the epithelial junctions would break down, and the cells of the stomach as well would break down, and then you would just have unfettered absorption from the stomach into the bloodstream and in the interstitial fluid, so it would eventually reach the lymphatic system. So it's really, really important. Probably the most familiar form of leaky stomach is a gastric ulcer that people are aware of, and again, that is the erosion pathway, that third pathway of permeability within the gut. So really important. The stomach is going to begin breaking down proteins. It's going to kill bacteria. So when you've caused damage to the stomach and you have a quote-unquote leaky stomach or gastric permeability, this is not the start of something good, and it's generally going to cause problems further down the road. You're not going to digest your food all the way, and you're not going to have a healthy overall experience whenever you eat your food. Generally speaking, since the stomach is very, very close to the mouth, problems that you have with eating that occur at the beginning of eating within the first hour or two are going to be problems that are related to something going wrong in the stomach. Drivers of gastric permeability. We have a few things going on here. Excess acid exposure. So you could just oftentimes people will hit a situation where their stomach is compromised, and then they get this excess acid exposure, and then it kind of continues on and on because they generally eat things that are acidic. They consume coffee, they eat spicy foods, they eat a lot of citrus foods, things like tomatoes, more acidic type of foods. Or alcohol is another problem as well. Alcohol will essentially erode any part of the digestive tract. So alcohol, it thins out that mucus layer and allows bacteria to interact with the epithelial cells, and alcohol in and of itself will interact as well. H. pylori. The interesting thing about H. pylori is there is a pretty long-going debate on where H. pylori is coming from, and part of that debate is that H. pylori is actually in the mouth, and as it overgrows, finds its way into the stomach, overgrows there, and then it can actually, H. pylori can really mess with your stomach acid production. H. pylori can kind of hide from stomach acid, and then it can kind of shut off the brakes, so you can just overproduce acid. That's what happens when you get an ulcer. That coupled with stress. Stress is another thing that can drive permeability effectively everywhere in the gastrointestinal tract. And then finally, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. These drugs can actually cause increased gastric permeability and permeability throughout the digestive tract, really. Moving along into the small intestine, we can take a look at the small intestine. Again, the small intestine has a loose outer mucus layer. This is because we need to absorb the nutrients from our food, but it's really interesting way of preventing bacteria from interacting with the intestinal epithelial wall. So what happens is this is just a constant flow of mucus. It's constantly produced, and so what you really get is this kind of flow this way. So if we look up here, we have the small intestinal lumen. Here we have this mucus layer, and this mucus layer is constantly produced, so it is kind of producing a pushing away of bacteria and bacterial components from the intestinal wall. So it's pushing it this way into the lumen. Since it's loose, and we have these antibacterial components here that we're secreting, our antimicrobial peptides. This kills the bacteria. It also causes it to clump together. And with this outward pressure away from the intestinal barrier, as we have motility pushing it this way, this stuff just really clumps together into this, this mucus and gets pushed towards the colon. So this is another kind of barrier defense that we have within the small intestine, because we cannot have a dense inner mucus layer if we also want to absorb our nutrients. So we have this looser outer layer, this looser mucus layer getting pushed away from the intestinal barrier. Then we have the migrating motor complex and general motility pushing all of this stuff towards the colon. We have more antimicrobial peptides and more of kind of a immune layer of protection in the small intestine, killing things so that we don't have to provide this dense barrier that would prevent nutrient absorption. Drivers of greater permeability in the intestine. The first we have is high bacterial load. What does this mean? It means having a lot of bacteria in your small intestine. So things like overeating, not practicing good oral health, because like I said, that oral cavity is the second highest amount of and diversity of bacteria in your digestive tract. So if you just have poor oral care, you're going to have a chamber at the very beginning of your gastrointestinal tract that's loaded with bacteria that's going to come through. The stomach is going to break down some of this. So if you have lower gastric acid output, this can also contribute to a higher bacterial load. Chronic overfeeding, you're not only feeding yourself, you're feeding your microbes. So any excess that kind of sticks around in your gut that you don't absorb is going to go towards your bacteria. Particularly, we're specifically referring to that in your small intestine, since we don't have that dense inner mucus layer. Just chronically grazing throughout the day, not brushing your teeth after meals. This is all going to contribute to a higher bacterial load in the small intestine. This causes inflammation, which causes paracellular permeability and can eventually lead to that erosion due to, the breakdown of the cells that make up the epithelial barrier. Dysbiosis, certain microbes help build a stronger barrier, and they help the small intestine kind of function in the way it's supposed to. When you have dysbiosis, this can increase inflammation, and it can effectively impair the mucosal defense system within the small intestine. So you will get bacteria encroaching into the epithelial cells, causing more inflammation, breaking down the mucus layer, and causing inflammation, and then causing leaky gut. Circadian disruption and sleep deprivation, these are separate issues. The gut is under heavy circadian regulation. Every single day you are going to have breakdown of cells in the intestinal barrier. Best to have that when you're not putting food down there, and at a time when you have the other layers of protection working properly. These are all regulated by your circadian rhythms, so when your circadian rhythms are disrupted, you will see greater permeability. Sleep deprivation is separate. This probably has as much to do with stress as it does the circadian components. Sleep deprivation has been shown to increase intestinal permeability. Alcohol, clearly, the Western diet, which is generally high in processed foods, low in fiber, and higher in fat, coupled with a high calorie load, Truth be told, if you're maintaining a healthy weight and eating something more like a keto diet, that's almost certainly better for you and probably leads to much lower permeability than a Western diet. And the Western diet is literally the worst type of diet you could eat from an intestinal permeability, leaky gut perspective. Food additives and emulsifiers, they can break down different aspects of the mucosal defense system that's functioning as these multiple barriers. High fat intake, again, we're not necessarily referring to a percentage of calories, but if you eat a lot of fat, and again, this is almost always going to be coupled with overeating, you're going to produce more bile acids. Bile acids can have problems. They can actually increase intestinal permeability. So just a higher overall calorie intake, with most of that coming from fat, is going to cause a greater intestinal permeability, quote unquote, leaky gut. Gluten in some, not very many, it does not cause permeability in everyone, as far as we know, simply because the data that people use to say that gluten does that to everyone is not good data. It's ex vivo, which is basically tissue samples exposed to gluten. For gluten to be a problem, you need a specific microbiome that processes gluten in a way that makes the gliadin available to cause inflammation. And most people actually have microbes that'll further break down this gliadin and make it an inner substance. So gluten is not a problem for most people. It's a problem clearly in people with celiac disease and potentially people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity as well. Prolonged exercise can cause increased permeability of the small intestine, especially when it's in the heat. When we exercise, we get a shunting of blood away from the gastrointestinal tract and towards the muscles so that it can power exercise. If this happens over a prolonged time, so we're talking, over an hour at a higher intensity, this is going to cause breakdown of the intestinal barrier, and you will get leaky gut from this, particularly in the heat. Another thing that happens is when it gets hot out, we get blood shunted towards the skin to help dissipate the heat. It causes sweating, and then that cools down the skin, which cools down the blood. But when the blood is kind of going out there, it's not going to the gut, and so we do get greater permeability with prolonged exercise in the heat than we do at a normal temperature. Stress, chronic stress, things of that nature. There's a paper showing that couples who argue more intensely and more often have greater permeability than couples who don't. And finally, NSAIDs again. Leaky colon. Here we have the layers of defense in the colon. And notice here we don't have these little kind of projections that we have in the small intestine. Those are called villi. And that is because we do not need to absorb nutrients from the large intestine. Therefore, we have this dense inner mucus layer, which is preventing these bacteria out in here from getting anywhere near the epithelial cells. Again, this is constant mucus secretion, so there is a kind of a tension pushing the bacteria away. And we have this outer mucus layer, which should be rich with microbes and microbial metabolites, which will keep pathogenic bacteria out. Microbial metabolites also regulate this barrier pretty well, this mucus layer. It's really interesting. So what we got is, say, you're eating food, you're eating fiber, and these microbes are fermenting the fiber into butyrate, which is a short-chain fatty acid. When butyrate gets here, butyrate causes these cells to make more mucus, and then during the period of time when we're not consuming food, or even if we just eat a low-fiber diet, these bacteria are going to begin fermenting away at this inner mucus layer, making it this loose outer mucus layer, and hopefully by the time they get anywhere near close, you're consuming food again, which will cause the mucus layer to get thicker and thicker and thicker. But if you do consume a low-fiber diet, this inner dense mucus layer, this protective layer, is going to be much, much thinner. The cool thing is when these microbes ferment this layer, they make a different short-chain fatty acid called propionate, and propionate can go to the liver and function as a precursor to glucose. So it helps, the liver uses propionate to make glucose so that it can keep our blood sugar up. This is actually part of that circadian regulation of what's happening in the gut and the microbiome that we were mentioning in one of the previous slides. But we have less immune protection here because we have this dense inner mucus layer functioning as more of a mechanical physical barrier. So we definitely want to keep that built up. So what are the drivers of colonic permeability? It's the same as what goes on in the small intestine, with one addition: excess sulfur in the colon. We get sulfur primarily through the sulfur-based amino acids, methionine and cysteine. When we overconsume these things, we absorb a lot of these sulfur amino acids, but these transporters can only do so much. So anything we eat in excess of what we can absorb into our body makes it to the colon, and sulfate-reducing bacteria break this down. Other microbes break it down as well, and what we get is something called hydrogen sulfide, which is problematic for multiple reasons. For one, it actually thins out that mucus layer. The mucins that make up the mucus layer are actually have sulfur in them, and when we have excess hydrogen sulfide, it breaks this down and makes it thinner and less dense and more permeable. And finally, hydrogen sulfide is processed by our epithelial cells with a similar enzyme, actually the same enzyme as butyrate is oxidated. Butyrate is that short-chain fatty acid we mentioned, which functions as the primary fuel source in the colon. So what ends up happening is when we have high amounts of hydrogen sulfide in the colon, that ends up preventing us from using butyrate for energy, and we can actually have a decrease in the energy generating capability within our colon. This primarily happens in the distal colon, which is on the left side of your body. That's the descending colon into the sigmoid colon, because we have a lot of butyrate producing capabilities more at the beginning of the colon, specifically in the ileum and the ascending colon. The microbes in there will get first crack at the fiber, but any excess sulfur-based amino acids are going to make it to that more distal end, and that can definitely wear down the intestinal barrier on that side of the body, and it will increase permeability. Testing for leaky gut is kind of a problem. It's very difficult to do in humans, and since it's kind of a new thing, normally what we do is, so we have a test for something, so we can validate new tests against that test to say, hey, you know, for example, if we're using something as a measure of blood sugar, for example, we can measure like the CGMs that are out. We can measure that against finger prick blood sugar testing, as well as hemoglobin A1C testing, to say, hey, yeah, this is working. We can validate it. Can't really do that in this. It's very difficult. We're relying on animal models. Probably the most accepted ways of testing for leaky gut use sugars as different types of probes. These different sugars we break down in different areas of our digestive tract, or we don't break them down at all. So if we recover them in our urine, we know that we have greater permeability. One of the ones that I'm most familiar with and I think is pretty good is the 5-sugar permeability and absorption test. It's important to point out that since it's, again, difficult to, we can see that, it does identify permeability in rodents and other animal models. It hasn't really been validated in humans, which makes it difficult, but it is helpful as a guide, and you would certainly use this. You wouldn't just use this information on its own. You'd use it with symptoms and patient history to kind of act as a guide to how a therapeutic approach can be developed and how well it's working. So you test, hey, yes, we see the permeability here and there. Let's address these areas. You address these areas, the permeability goes down, then you have a pretty good idea that you're on the right track. So what is this 5-sugar intestinal permeability and absorption test? It uses a drink with sucrose, lactose, raffinose, mannitol, and cellobiose in it. You drink it down, and then you recover your urine overnight, and we're looking at the different proportions of these different sugars in the urine. This helps identify where permeability is present from what we find in the urine. For example, sucrose is a disaccharide that we break down readily at the intestinal brush border in the duodenum of the small intestine. So if we give somebody sucrose and then we find that sucrose in their urine, they're not breaking it down there, so chances are they have greater permeability in their stomach. So we can target our treatment to the stomach if this is the kind of sugar we find that is the most problematic. Another one, cellobiose, we do not break down or absorb, so if we find this in the urine, this is an indication that we have increased paracellular permeability. Cellobiose cannot take the transcellular pathway However, it could you could absorb it due to a gastric ulcer as well. So we're simply just using this 5-sugar IPA test, and there are a lot of different combinations and proportions that we can look at to say, hey, I think we have a problem absorbing things in the small intestine, or we have a problem with sucrose making it into the bloodstream. Therefore, we have a problem within our stomach. We need to address the stomach and things that can cause problems there first. So finally, we'll discuss the basics for addressing leaky gut. Now, these are the low-hanging fruit. These are the things you have to do to make sure that your intestinal barrier is functioning well. Most people, the first thing they want to know is, hey, what supplement can I take to fix leaky gut? What medicine can I take to fix leaky gut? And that's simply not how it works. You have to address the basics first. Once you're addressing the basics, if you still have a problem, you would want to kind of go further down that rabbit hole. Maybe you use supplemental butyrate. You take Tributrin as a postbiotic to heal your gut. Maybe you try, a probiotic or a prebiotic, or kind of changing your diet up to kind of lead to a healthier intestinal barrier. So we're going to start. Most important things, we want to make sure sleep and circadian rhythms are locked down. Gut function is regulated by circadian rhythms. Sleep disruption can cause intestinal permeability, so we want to make sure we are consistently falling asleep at the same time. We're getting good sleep. We have good sleep hygiene. Our room is dark and not loud. That we are going to bed regularly. We're getting physical activity and light exposure throughout the day, and we're eating within kind of at the longest a 12-hour window. Stick to 3 meals or less. This will do a few things. As I mentioned, kind of a little bit in the small intestine, we have this outward pressure of the mucus layer pushing microbes towards the lumen, and then we have peristalsis and the migrating motor complex pushing food from the small intestine into the large intestine. This is what we want, since that small intestine is kind of using the immune system more to prevent intestinal permeability. We want to get that stuff from the small intestine into the colon as quickly as possible, because there we have a dense inner mucus layer, so we don't have to rely on the immune system to kind of fire up every once in a while. So we want to stick to 3 meals or less. The migrating motor complex is how we move things along that way, and that generally starts 3 to 4 hours after meals, and it's about a 90-minute cycle. Also, with regard to 3 meals, it's a lot easier to manage your oral health when you're only consuming 3 meals. You can brush and floss after each meal. If you're grazing throughout the day, you're just going to be increasing the number of microbes in your mouth constantly. You'll be swallowing more, so you'll be exposing your entire digestive tract to more microbes, and generally speaking, if you're eating a crappier diet, you are going to have crappier microbes going through your gut. And more on managing oral health care, just make sure you go to the dentist and get your cleaning every 6 months. That's going to knock down all these bacteria that cause plaque. Those are generally bacteria that are unhealthy for many reasons and through many areas of the digestive tract. So make sure you are getting your cleanings every 6 months on top of brushing and flossing after every meal. Limit alcohol intake. Don't have to tell you. It's going to erode effectively every layer of this mucosal defense system that's keeping your intestinal barrier strong. So limit alcohol intake. The recommendations are no more than 2 units of alcohol a day for men and 1 unit of alcohol per day for women. A unit of alcohol is either a 12-ounce 5% alcohol beer or a shot of straight alcohol. They're going to have basically the same amount. If you're talking about like a 6-ounce glass of wine, that'll be at 10% alcohol. These are all 1 unit, so plan accordingly. Avoid the Western dietary pattern. Again, eating high amounts of processed foods, high calorie load, all that stuff is not good. You'll want to shift more towards an omnivorous, high fiber diet. Is this the only diet you can eat to maintain a strong intestinal barrier and prevent leaky gut? We don't know. We have no idea. We do know that an omnivorous high fiber diet does protect against leaky gut. It is also potential that certain keto diets and lower carb diets can also provide the same thing, whether they have fiber or not. We don't know, but we do know an omnivorous high fiber diet will help protect against leaky gut based on all the data we have. Don't overeat. So this kind of sets up something. Some people really can't stick to an omnivorous diet. For some reason, they just always overeat on it. Those people, maybe a keto diet is better for them. And you certainly can incorporate some fiber into a ketogenic diet, but ultimately probably the most important thing for preventing greater intestinal permeability, and the one we actually have data on in humans, is to make sure you're not overeating your calories. Calorie restriction, severe calorie restriction, actually improves intestinal permeability greatly, and it seems to be, it's not necessarily related to weight loss, it's the decreased caloric load. So don't overeat. That's probably the most important thing you can do. So find a diet that gets you to maintain a healthy weight, which would be a BMI, somewhere around the 25 range. And then finally, test and address. Don't assume you have leaky gut. Everybody who has a digestive problem assumes that they have leaky gut. You may not have it. Everybody experiences it effectively every day to some extent. So you may think that your gastrointestinal problem either comes with or is caused by leaky gut, but unless you test, you have no idea. And if you don't test, you have no idea what you should address. Again, I think the 5-sugar permeability test is fantastic for this, but again, it's not that useful if you're not coupling it with a thorough patient history as well as symptoms and how you react to your diet. This wraps up this presentation on leaky gut. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you all enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms, please drop them down in the comment section below. Also, if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, share our videos on social media so people can see them. This is really the only way we will know for sure if people want more things like this, if they want to dive deeper into the topic of leaky gut. The only way we know is if you're liking and sharing these videos, if you're subscribing based on these videos and leaving comments for us. So thank you very much for listening in, and take care.